Hello and welcome back to Monster Consortium. I am Sean Probber, and I am joined from Thailand this episode by George McMillan. Now, last episode we had gone through a bit of the conflict that we were having with Russia, the United States, and a bit more context. We wanted to add a bit more context to what was going on over there. Today we're looking for a similar goal, although this time we are talking about China. Now, gone are the days of simple conflicts of a country having an issue with another country, and you hit the field and get things sorted out in a matter of days. And with our more intertwined world, growing more intertwined each and every day, we see when there are conflicts between two nations just how complicated and terrible these things get. One of the major issues with China right now is that they are one of the second largest contributors to the United Nations. The United States, of course, being one on that list. And you start to have an increasing amount of influence coming from China, influencing the United Nations for that reason. So, quite possibly, even American money that goes into these programs ends up being used, good chance, against us in many of these conflicts. China owns about 192,000 acres of farmland in just the United States. They own 100 ports in 63 countries globally. So when there are these kind of conflicts, we end up with a bit of overlap and quite a lot of drama at every step. So to jump in and to take us in, let's take a look at a map of the area we're discussing, and hopefully be able to break things down a little bit easier with that. So as you can see here, we're looking at the South China Sea, which is the major topic of today, the drama and battles that are going on right now. And to start things off, let's go into this recent global incident where China actually was using laser attacks against Filipino ships. Yeah, so there we have it. As we saw a few days ago, there were some indications of Chinese space lasers. Now, with an attack like this, with a laser attack, what exactly are we looking at here, George? What's the goal of this?
Uh, in in personal force escalation messaging or sequencing, lasers are used in uh, in police interactions, or we use them overseas to keep people back. One story that comes up, I was talking to two Navy SEALs that were involved in the conflict in Najaf back in, what was that, 2002 or whatever that was, during the invasion of Iraq, and they were talking about the local Shia population did not want them to go to the old sacred Shia mosque towards those things, so they started moving on the SEAL teams. So they were waving the SEAL teams were waving the crowd back, and they kneeled down. This is a famous event that was on CNN and all the cable news channels way back in the day. And one of them said, well, they kept on coming, and we kneeled down saying that we weren't going to go towards the mosque, and the crowd kept on coming anyway. Then they leveled their weapons, and they said what broke the sound barrier was when they turned their green lasers on, their visible lasers on, and then the crowd started to back up because everybody knows shots come next. So in a force escalation sequence, since if you go presence, soft voice, loud voice, hands on, intermediaries and guns. Well, since you're at a big distance, obviously, and there aren't really any intermediaries on a ship. You're not going to hit them with a baton, or you're not going to hit the person with a with pepper spray. In this case, you're either going to hit them with live fire or not. So I mean, it's using the green lasers is that force escalation point where the shots come next. So it's an indication of what level in the force escalation process that the Chinese are willing to go. And all law enforcement agencies all over the world teach that force escalation sequence.
That's interesting. So it's definitely an aggressive act, one way or the other.
Yeah, since you don't have loudspeakers to go that distance, lasers go that distance. So you're sending the next thing is going to be the shot across the bow, the warning shot. And it'd be that force escalation. So it'd be 2 steps down from you're actually going to take, actually exchange fire.
Got it. So now this received a ton of press recently, but it's not at all the beginning of this conflict between China and the Philippines, with America kind of backing the Philippines. It even predates the current leader, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And we have some clips here of just a little while back with Duterte and what was going on at that point.
2016, the Philippines filed a landmark case against China at The Hague. The ruling declared China's 9-dash claim as invalid, a decision China rejects. Despite international condemnation, China continues its reclamation and expansion of many areas in the South China Sea, setting up maritime patrols and airships on disputed islands and reefs. Tension has been rising in the area for years. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has refused to assert the landmark ruling and taken a softer approach to dealing with Beijing. But his critics say he's yielded too often and too much in exchange for promises of grants and projects that remain largely unfulfilled.
Now we hear at the end of that video these kind of agreements with grants and promises. That seems almost like China's currency in recent times. We talked before about just how many ports they've acquired around the globe, and this seems like a bit of their strategy of getting into these countries and garnering influence through those means. Now, since that occurred, we've seen just a total increase in these kind of behaviors. That was in 2016. What's the best signs of escalation since that point that we should be on the lookout for?
Well, I mean, first thing to cover is what's causing the escalation. A few things are causing the escalation. The rise of China as industrial power, because it went from being energy sufficient to being woefully energy insufficient. Because of its industrialization and its rising standards of living, it's now consuming way more oil than it was 30 years ago. So now it's become ever increasingly dependent on oil and natural gas from the South China Sea area, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and especially from the Middle East. So in case of a war, they would be losing a significant portion of their energy needs, and that would collapse their economy. During the Silk Road project, they tried to internalize as much of their energy resources into the Central Asian stands as possible. And that occurred in the mid to late 90s on to 2010. And then it got more aggressive after that. especially more aggressive after the 2014 Maidan Revolution. They started building as many pipelines as they could into Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, especially Kazakhstan. And then after 2010, especially after 2014, with the continued eastward expansion of NATO, Power Siberia 1 pipeline between Russia and China became more important. Now they're trying to build a pipeline from Yamal, the one that goes into Poland and Ukraine. They're trying to build that down to down to Urumqi and then into Beijing, but that's going to be decades. But it's going to be, well, maybe not decades, but that's going to be like 5 years away. So China's particularly vulnerable to having their energy supplies cut off. And the Strait of Hormuz, Strait of Malacca, and the South China Sea. So now the South China Sea is ever more important to China. And it's always been it's been the UK strategy going back through the colonial times, and even the Dutch and the Portuguese in that area, to control that area and control those shipping choke points. I mean, the audience can Google maritime choke points and see exactly what I'm talking about. If they want a visual on a global scale of which choke points militaries deem important during wartime. It hasn't changed in a long time, but the increase in technology and the increase in dependence on oil imports from the Middle East is what makes that part of the China Sea ever more important to China. Also, with the containment strategy of George McMillan in 1947, the United States has always wanted to surround Russia and surround China, and work in Nicholas Speakman's term, the professor at Yale, and then later, more recently, Wolfowitz and Brzezinski, to try to control Central Asia, to keep Russia and China apart. And since Central Asia is tremendously oil and gas rich, using ever since Operation Cyclone, I have to throw in the dates and times because people don't forget, or people forget how long the Brzezinski and the CIA with Stansfield Turner was there to try to destabilize Central Asia on purpose. During the after the 1979 Shia revolution, Brzezinski and the CIA and Stansfield Turner aggressively facilitated the increase of Wahhabi fundamentalism in that region. And the CIA and the British, of course, supplied arms to the Mujahideen that later on became the Taliban.
Plays.
Yeah, it later on became the Taliban. And it's actually, these are actually, generic terms that mean everything and mean nothing when you actually get into the different ethnic and religious groups that are involved in that. You get a Sunni Shia split. So China, that being said, China's been wanting to go and building immense amount of pipelines and ports in that area to make it so the United States Navy or the British Navy can't interfere with their shipping and their oil supplies. So the more China does that, the more aggressively the United States tries to destabilize that area, either with the violent extremist organizations or through political protesting. So you see a lot of groups backed by CAA Political Action Center, which also funds and works with the National Endowment for Democracy and its affiliated groups. Then there's a whole bunch of DC NGOs and think tanks that are also involved in these areas. They'll use exchange students, large funding from the oligarchs in the different areas to fund protests. So you have the democracy movement in Myanmar that's meant to block China's oil and gas and port railway project in Chaiphao, Myanmar. I know my Myanmar pronunciation is going to be horrible. They're also backing, pro-democracy groups to lead protests in Bangkok. They did have some National Endowment for Democracy groups and operating out of Phnom Penh, but they were outlawed. And a lot of the Soros-funded groups are operating in these areas, and the governments are trying to push them out. So, point here is, in my other videos, I talk about the 6 power center doctrine, where the United States is trying to, in Power Center 1, in a Eurocentric and a Merocentric power center doctrine, you have the United States in Power Center 1 trying to always ally with Western Europe. That would be Power Center number 2. And on the other side, the Marshall Plan after World War II built up Japan and South Korea. So that would be a 3rd power center. Then the other power centers 4 and 5 would be Russia and China. So the idea was always to contain both, surround both, and try to split both up. Okay, in the past 2 decades, Russia and China have been trying to integrate with railway, port, pipeline, highway infrastructure. So what you call that in geostrategic speak is PMECE and dime integration. In Clausewitzian terms, the stronger economy you have, the more military you have, the more diplomatic power you have. It can flow in either direction, but PMECE is an acronym for political, military, economic, social, infrastructural, and informational. DIME is diplomatic, infrastructural, military, and economic. So that the more infrastructural programs that you have between the countries that link them over land, it makes it more and more difficult for the United States and the UK, being a sea power, to interfere with the overland integration. So
now it seems as if in recent months, in this last year with the conflict with Ukraine, that we've really thrown away that game to a large extent, and we've driven Russia and China together in a way that seems like they're more linked now than ever before, maybe in a post-communist world.
Yeah,
they're seeing emerging, it seems, of those 2 power centers, and I think that could be very problematic. I think to really understand the topic a little bit more for everyone, I think it's important to know exactly what the importance of the South China Sea. So let's take a look at this clip here, and between this and the next 3, we really see exactly what's going on here and why the entire world is fighting for this area.
With these islands, China's trying to lay claim to one of the most important areas of ocean in the world, the South China Sea. The South China Sea is incredibly rich in natural resources. 11 billion barrels of oil, 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 10% of the world's fisheries. Most importantly, though, 30% of the world's shipping trade flows through here, to the booming population centers and economic markets of Southeast Asia.
Right, so we see a little bit there on just how valuable this area is, and George, you brought up the military choke points, but there is quite a bit of value in terms of just profit here. What do you think is what do you think the main driver is for China in this situation?
Well, everybody wants the resources.
Yeah.
Why this is particularly important to China is it's a close by energy source, so it doesn't have to go through the Straits of Hormuz. doesn't have to go through the Strait of Malacca. It's very, very close. And if the United States wants to interfere in that area, well, the best thing for China to do is to push the United States out ahead of time. The United States trying to push in is actually very provocative, because it means that, it's a chance for the conflict to occur right there. Next issue you have is the I'll just throw in a little bit of academic history. Alfred Mackinder is the father of geopolitical geostrategic theory at Oxford, St. Anthony's College, I believe. He started that in 1898. It's land power versus sea power, heartland versus rimland or coastal peripheral areas. He kind of changes the nomenclature, but you get the gist of where the heartland is. They're talking about Russia and the Asian steppes and Siberia, and then the coastal power, the rimland. They're talking about all the coastal areas. So when you get into this case, it's always been, going back for, with 200 some odd years with Britain and the Great Game, to always block in Russia's ports. Well, the British, UK, Portuguese, Dutch have always had a strong presence in the Indo-Pacific, because these are all naval sea powers. So they're playing the sea power strategy of controlling the rimland and trying to get as many allies in that area as possible. You had French Indochina back in the day. The British controlled the whole eastern seaboard of China, and then all the way up to Hong Kong recently, when they left Hong Kong in 97. So the purpose of that used to be easier to move sailing ships around the oceans rather than travel over land like Marco Polo did way back in the day. But now, of course, with the invention of the railway and increasing railroad infrastructure, now you can move and highways and airplanes, and then you have fiber optic communications and telecommunications. There's different ways to speed up and integrate the heartland that weren't available 100 years ago. So
a lot of this has been outlined through international law. So our next video shows the exclusive economic zone, and this is essentially the international standard on how these conflicts are typically resolved in terms of who owns specific areas. And it seems like the issue here is that China does not seem to agree on all this. So let's take a look at kind of the international standard on these economic lines.
It's an extremely important body of water, and right now 5 countries lay claim to some part of it. Now, most countries base their claim off the UN Law of the Seas, which says a country's territorial waters extend 200 miles off their shore, an area called the Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. Countries have exclusive rights to all the resources and trade in their EEZ. It's their sovereign territory. So, for example, any oil that's found within 200 miles off the coast of Vietnam belongs exclusively to Vietnam. But any area that isn't in an EEZ is regarded as international waters, and it falls under UN maritime law, which means everybody shares it. Now, every country in the South China Sea region uses this 200-mile EEZ threshold to determine its claims. All except China.
Now, just let's continue that thought. I think that makes the most sense. Now, China disagrees with that, and our next video shows exactly what they're thinking their land is, through their 9-dash line.
China argues they have a historical claim to the South China Sea, dating back to naval expeditions in the 15th century. And they mark it using a really confusing border called the 9-dash line. Following World War II, Japan, who had dominated the entire region, lost all control of its surrounding seas. China used the moment to claim the South China Sea by drawing this imprecise line on the map that encompassed 90% of the South China Sea. It became known as the 9-dash line. And when the UN established the 200-mile EEZ in 1973, China stuck to its own line, refusing to clarify its boundaries and ignoring claims by other countries.
Now that gives us a good idea of just how long this conflict has been going around at this point. So with China disagreeing, is there any way that there could be a meeting point here between the global community standard and China, and then what would that look like?
Yeah, well, for China, well, since the United States strategy is always to take the first island chains, being Taiwan, Japan, and the Philippines. The Chinese counter strategy is always to try to push the United States and the United States Navy off the first island chain, which is why taking Taiwan is important for them. Having better relationships, or pushing the U.S. military, especially the Navy, out of the Philippines. So they would like to push them back, and then you have their energy needs close by in that area, so they're becoming more aggressive to try to push the United States out of that area. Now, people have to keep in mind the Western European oil and gas companies have been in that area for 100 years. You're talking about the big one, ExxonMobil, all the U.S. firms, British Petroleum, of course, Schlumberger, Total, all those people are all over there. So, did I mention Royal Dutch Shell? I mean, it's where they started, right? So that area, if there was a time of war, the Western companies have been in that area, controlling it for so long. China needs it for their increased consumption of products and their increase of vulnerability that the Western navies can always cut them off. They've tried to mitigate that with overland routes, but like I said, to become fully sufficient with Russian oil and gas, which Russia's got plenty of gas. The problem is, by the time that they've recognized the problem with the United States more aggressively, way more aggressively pressing the rimland strategies of surrounding Russia and China and trying to separate them, then now the more that China is trying to push back, so that the big pipeline projects would be another 5 years away from getting completed to get enough Russian oil and gas to China to support their economy and need no other oil and gas from the Middle East. So right now, it's becoming important for China to keep those, to dominate their sphere of influence in that area while they're still vulnerable to Middle East oil and gas imports. So they're basically asserting their own Monroe Doctrine in that area. When the United States announced its Monroe Doctrine, a long time ago, you didn't have nearly as much technological advantage. I mean, you still had sailing ships back then. In this case, the colonial powers have been there for 200 years. So China is trying to push out the colonial powers that have been entrenched there for a very, very long time, where the Monroe Doctrine was just trying to prevent Europeans from really establishing stronger, from becoming entrenched. So China's
that's an
trying to
interesting
push
distinction. because
Yeah,
we do get a lot of feedback, a lot of criticism that comes from China, that comes from Russia in these
yeah,
conflicts, and they say, well, look, you have this Monroe Doctrine that's been well established, where you've taken ownership of a hemisphere, and then the United States seems to be wanting to put military bases and troops and control over all of these areas. But that's an interesting distinction that you draw in that
yeah,
situation. Now, the fear in all of these incidents is that in a Cold War setting, is that one day an event could happen that could perhaps cause war for a number of different countries. And there's some international incident. And we saw something kind of close happen with China being so desperate to assert control. They actually formed a blockade of Philippine products and ships, and the United States had to take action. So let's dive into the video where that occurs and see what's recently been happening.
Now, as we know, the Chinese Communist Party claims the entire South China Sea is Chinese territory, putting it at odds with all the surrounding countries. And yet, a few days after China's Coast Guard confronted Filipino ships, Chinese leader Xi Jinping told Southeast Asian leaders China is not a threat, and Beijing would not bully its smaller regional neighbors. But the Philippines didn't take this lying down. They told China to back off. And to the Biden administration's credit, the U.S. State Department issued a strong statement standing with the Philippines and said an armed attack on Philippine ships in the South China Sea would invoke the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. In other words, they told the Chinese regime to back off or the U.S. would get involved. And guess what? The Chinese Communist Party withdrew the blockade. And earlier this week, supply boats did finally reach the Filipino Marines.
Now, it certainly seems so. There's so many parallels between what we're seeing here and what we're seeing with Russia, with these treaties that we've established with Ukraine, for instance, and when they wanted to when we wanted them to get rid of nuclear powers, and we made our agreement that we would protect them in the event that Russia would come. And it seems like we're looking at a similar situation. Should we be more hopeful about what's going on in China right now than what we're seeing in Russia?
well, the reason why I brought up the original five power center doctrine, and then we'll get into this the six power center, the Asian centric six power center doctrine towards the end here, is this China wants to assert itself to push back against against naval interference. So the way it's making its legal claim is the 9-dash line. Now, of course, since the United States and the UK, okay, they got a small military now, but since the United States has always had such extreme naval dominance in that area, then China has been trying to play catch up over the past 3 decades. So they're trying to increase, just all the amount of ships that they can, because we're going to get into a little bit more. They started, making the fake fishing vessels in that area to move. So and then they started building all those atolls and reefs, started building them up into the man-made islands, and started building ports and runways on them, and start putting assets in there, because it's right in the middle. The Spratly Island areas are right in the middle where those in the gap in the EEZs. So they try to move into that area, so now they can make the legal claim for their 9-dash line. So they moved into those things, claimed the islands. Now they're trying to pretend they have a bona fide claim in those areas to push the other countries in that region of the world, back a little bit. Yeah, it's a bogus claim, but again, the importance of that area is so the United States can interdict and cut off the oil and gas supplies in the event of a war.
Yeah, and it seems like we're preparing, or China is preparing for a future where they could very well be in conflict with the West. And we're
Yeah.
seeing more and more belligerence. Let's go to the video about what's going on in the Subi Reef. That's only adds to the drama here.
Yeah.
The U.S. destroyer ship sailed just 12 miles off the shore of one of China's man-made islands in the Spratlys. China sent out their own destroyer and a patrol boat as a warning. China's building these islands in order to increase control around the surrounding waters, using a strategy that they've deemed the cabbage strategy, where they surround a contested island with as many ships as possible. In May of 2013, China sent several ships to Ayungin Shoal, which is just 105 nautical miles off the coast of the Philippines, well within that 200-mile EEZ. The Philippines has 8 soldiers stationed there. Like wrapping leaves around a cabbage, the Chinese sealed off the Philippines' access to Ayungin Shoal with fishing boats, surveillance ships, and Navy destroyers, creating a blockade so that the Filipinos can't receive shipments of food and supplies.
It just strikes me how similar that graphic is to our old favorite game of Battleship, right? Who would have thought?
Huh.
Who would have thought that that was such an accurate game for these kind of situations? So yeah, it appears that the aggression kind of coming from both sides is escalating tremendously here. So what should we be on the lookout for in the next few months for the next kind of battleground
Yeah.
or conflict?
What should be stated in this, the historical context is if you look at Vietnam or the Philippines or Japan or Korea, these ethnic rivalries have gone back for a long time. So the Philippines and the Vietnamese have always felt threatened by China, and ever since the Mongols had the biggest land empire that ever existed, it actually moved down towards the Chinese Vietnamese border, but it also threatened all the first island chains, including the Philippines. So these ethnic rivalries go back a very long time. In this case, China wants to move into the Spratly Islands so it can make its claim and push its territorial boundaries out. Philippines obviously pushes back. They put, since the Chinese are putting people out on these islands and making the man-made islands, then the Philippines respond by putting people out in their islands, so they have a presence. Because your first order of escalation is presence, soft voice. You get along normally. Antagonistic, somebody yells at somebody else. Then you have the intermediaries, before you get to a deadly force conflict. So that's why I go through the FLETC use of force model and apply it to international conflict here. So the first thing that the Philippines do is put people out there, so you've established a presence. And then they've told the Chinese verbally, don't come here. The Chinese are pushing back. So there's an escalation violence. I just go over the FLETC use of force model because it's all the countries' law enforcement agencies teach something similar to that. So it's a well-known force escalation sequence. Now, in this case, what's important is the importance of the Philippines to the United States. It would be very difficult for the United States to field an army now. Our Navy supposedly has something like 30 ships that are mothballed because they don't have enough manning because the enlistments are down. The enlistments recruits are way down. Same thing for the Army. So if we were supposed to have a two-front war with Russia and China. Of course, I argue the possibility of a three-front war in the Middle East. We'll get into that another day. What would the United States do for manpower if the recruiting standards are so long? Is the United States going to have a conscription? Well, no. It looks like, in Eastern Europe, they're fighting down to the last Ukrainian, like Professor Mearsheimer discusses. In Asia, it looks like what the United States wants to do is to get the Filipinos involved, because they have a huge population. Again, Indonesia has a huge population also. So the United States Duterte wanted fewer U.S. military bases over there. You have Ferdinand Marcos Jr. in power now. He wants more American bases there. It's good for the United States because now it solves the manpower shortage. You could have a war in East Asia and fight with somebody else's people. The casualties wouldn't come back to the United States. The body bags wouldn't come back to the United States.
And
So
we've
for the
taken
United
over
States,
a few more bases in the Philippines already. So we're already seeing this kind of increased funding into the Philippines. It wouldn't be a Cold War if we weren't propping up dictators in different countries. So there's
yeah,
something to it.
and taking countries that have manpower and the ethnic rivalries or religious rivalries, and we arm them to use them as proxies against Russia and China. That's the
So
original
this is
five
the
powers.
Ukraine. This is the South China version of Ukraine. It would seem that the Philippines are potentially are Ukraine of that area.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure we'll be willing to fight to the last Filipino as well.
Yeah, that would be. There's a lot of them, so that'd be a longer fight than in Ukraine.
Now we were talking earlier a bit about just the increased influence of China in the international scene, whether we're talking about the United Nations or otherwise. Do you think that with this influence that they might be able to form a consensus internationally that could counter the United States, or will the United States just push back on that?
The China can't really improve relationships with the Philippines. I mean, they try to assuage them as much as possible, but yeah, these things go back.
Yeah.
The hostilities go back centuries. I mean, but that being said, China has a huge presence economically of moving factories to all these different countries. Along with Japan and along with Korea. If you go to Vietnam, I mean, there's Chinese, Koreans, Japan. They're all selling their the different products that we all know. Japanese are always selling cars and motorcycles, and Koreans, Samsung phones and LG and all that, and their own cars. So there is a heavy economic rivalry there also. The Chinese are really trying to make their inroads into Laos and Cambodia, which hopefully I'll be there in a week or two, looking at their different infrastructural projects. So hopefully when we do our next series of videos, I'll be, instead of Thailand, I'll be there. So yeah, China would like to get along better with its neighbors for different economic reasons, but it still needs that economic zone in the Spratly Islands to control that area to try to push the United States Navy out. So in one way, it doesn't want to go there because it's going to antagonize the neighbors. But in another sense, it has to move into that area to push the United States out. So they're trying to do a balancing act. But they're the bigger country. they're going ahead and making the man-made islands, the Spratly Island area, and they're just going to have to deal with the neighbors the best as they can. So that that's the trade-off that they've taken.
Got it. So last episode, I had asked you about how hopeful you are that things are going to go back to normal in Russia, and we're going to split up and the war is going to stop. And we neither of us were too positive about that. Do you see a more hopeful solution? What would a diplomatic solution that worked for all people look
Well,
like, or is there just none in this conflict?
I was watching Brian Berletic's channel today, and he was talking. He played the old clip of Wesley Clark. It was made a long time ago. I didn't have a chance to see when it was made, but it was a clip that was been out for decades now, and he was having a discussion with Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz just prior to the lead up to the Iraq War, where he said he was working at the Pentagon and had the conversation where somebody told him that they were going to invade Iraq, and he wanted to know why, where they connected to 9/11, and he said no, and then he's talking to a guy who says, well, it's not just Iraq. I'm trying to paraphrase a long story here.
Yeah,
he says, the United States,
Syria.
They want to get rid of all the post-Soviet dictators in the Middle East and Central Asia, and which is, I mean, I was all for that back then too, because I mean they're really horrible people. It's the most corrupt leaders in the world at that time. So the United States has had this doctrine. Well, then it was using the global war on terror, to move into those buffer zones to contain Russia and separate Russia and China. So this has been the mindset of the United States, from Paul Wolfowitz wrote his paper in 1992, and it's followed by the Rand reports, and of course I've done some lengthy videos on there on my own YouTube channel, GWM3 Impact Analytics. So I bring that up because you have what Wesley Clark was talking about in the Middle East. You have a same strategy to move into the Indo-Pacific and to contain China. We exported a lot of our jobs there in one sense, and then when they got too powerful, now we want to reverse course, because the idea was, if you move businesses there, they would liberalize, and if they had American dollars, the only thing that you could do with American dollars would be buy American goods, and the trade would balance. I remember having a conversation with someone in 1999 or 1998 about this, and I didn't think it was going to work then. It was by a Chicago economics graduate.
Very
and I said no.
optimistic.
Yeah, and I said no. You can always buy operating companies and land, and that's what they've done. Instead of buying goods and balancing trade, they just come over here and buy pharma, or they buy they buy companies and then move them over to China, and then the United States becomes deindustrialized, because that used to be the old mercantilism. The United States thought that was so outdated, but China is still extremely mercantilistic. So since they've become mercantilistic, we have to become more mercantilistic. But in this case, it means more U.S. naval intervention in the Indo-Pacific.
Got it. So I think that's a good end point for this episode. I hope we provided a bit more context to the topic than we've been seeing on the news. I think it often gets presented as just one scary event after one scary event, but I think by talking about just exactly how long these issues, much like the Russian issue, has occurred over many centuries at this point. It shows just how deep these issues are and how much needs to get untangled to stop these
Right.
conflicts. So, do you have a final point, George?
Yeah. What's different in this channel is I really want to stress the grand strategies.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I said, I mentioned that Halford Mackinder was the father of the grand strategies, because what's pertinent here to the viewer is there's only a handful of universities that teach them. Oxford, where Mackinder started it, Yale, where Speakman went, but along with George Kennan and John Lewis Gaddis, is taught at Harvard, where Kissinger had his seminars with Klaus Schwab. And it's also, John Lewis Gaddis also taught at the Naval War College, because Speakman, or Mackinder, Speakman, and Mahan, land power versus sea power strategies are obviously big to the Navy. So out of these few universities is where the US and UK intel agencies recruit people from. And one of the reasons why I mentioned Wesley Clark is he was talking about these strategies that were developed by the Pentagon. Okay, it's not really developed by the Pentagon. They're developed by students that go to these particular programs. And you can download the syllabi. But what Wesley Clark was talking about was, when was this ever debated in the United States? When was it debated in a presidential platform? When was it debated in Congress? Same in the UK. It never has been. Most people have never even heard of the grand strategies before. But that is actually the underlying doctrine that's running United States and UK foreign policy. And it's one of the best kept secrets when it's hiding in plain sight. You can just go on Amazon and buy the books. You can go on YouTube and get and Google some of these. Well, you can Google all kinds of on YouTube. Watch John Lewis Gaddis lectures or George Kennan lectures. But this is where the strategic strategy comes from, and that's what the viewer really needs to know.
Yeah, when we hear about issues with fears of democracy, this seems so relevant, that there are so many topics that we discuss at length in America, and we talk about every election cycle. But this goes to show exactly how much can be unchanged, and how many of these conflicts and plans have nothing to do with who happens to be in the executive branch at any given
Right.
time. These things continue forever.
Yeah.
So thank you very
We'll
much,
get it.
George, for joining us again. Who knows what country you'll be in next time?
Yeah.
But hopefully we have as good of an internet connection as we do today. So thank you very much for joining. I want to remind the audience to like, subscribe, share endlessly on your social media. We'll catch you next time. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot.